It was supposed to be a perfectly normal flight, the kind of journey people take without giving a second thought. Families were settling in, business travelers opened laptops, children argued over window seats, and the cabin buzzed with casual conversations. The air was filled with the comforting hum of the engines, the soft clatter of seatbelts being fastened, and the rustle of magazines flipping. Aiden, a 22-year-old passenger sitting near the middle of the plane, leaned back in his seat, feeling that familiar thrill of takeoff fading into quiet routine. He watched clouds drift by as the aircraft soared smoothly through the sky, cruising at high altitude with no sign of trouble ahead. But then everything changed in a split second. Without warning, a violent jolt shook the aircraft so hard that it felt like the sky itself had grabbed the plane. Coffee cups flew, bags toppled from open compartments, and a horrifying chorus of gasps filled the cabin. The calm was instantly shattered. Before anyone could even process what was happening, a second shake hit, bigger, louder, more terrifying. Passengers clutched their armrests and each other as the plane suddenly dipped downward. The aisle lights flickered, the air pressure dropped, and then, with a chilling hiss, oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling, swinging wildly above people's heads like pendulums of panic. Screams erupted. The world inside the cabin devolved into pure fear. A trembling voice from the cockpit finally cut through the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a critical systems failure." The captain's words were broken, unstable, which made them even more terrifying. "We are doing everything we can to regain control. Please remain seated and put on your oxygen masks immediately." People were crying, shouting prayers, gripping the armrests so tight their knuckles turned white. Some tried to call loved ones, hands shaking so badly they could barely hold their phones. Others froze in shock, staring at the masks hanging inches from their faces, unable to move. Aiden's heart pounded against his ribs as he pulled the oxygen mask over his mouth, his breath hot and shaky underneath it. He could feel every nerve in his body screaming for answers. This wasn't turbulence, this wasn't normal. Something was terribly, dangerously wrong. The plane was dropping fast. You could feel the ground rushing closer with every passing second. The overhead signs flickered, and the aisles vibrated as if the aircraft were being pulled apart by invisible hands. Cabin crew tried to regain control, shouting instructions over the rising noise. "Stay calm, fasten your seatbelts tight. Oxygen first, then help those next to you." But their voices were swallowed by panic, drowned by sobs and terrified questions. One flight attendant stumbled, bracing herself against the seats as she tried to move toward the cockpit, only to be knocked back by another sudden plunge. Aiden watched her, noticing the fear in her eyes, a fear even professionals couldn't hide. The plane felt helpless. And so did everyone inside it. Through the narrow windows, the sky was no longer peaceful. Dark storm clouds closed in around them, swallowing all sunlight, turning the world outside into a turbulent abyss. Lightning flashed, lighting up terrified faces like snapshots of horror. Bags and loose items rolled across the floor as the aircraft violently tilted to one side. A child screamed for their mother, an older man clutched his chest in panic. Every single person understood the same horrifying truth: this might be the end. Aiden's thoughts were racing, not just about himself, but about everyone around him, strangers yet suddenly connected by fate. He could taste the fear in the air, thick and suffocating even with oxygen flowing. He pressed his head back, trying to stay calm, but his mind kept replaying the captain's words: critical systems failure. That phrase alone was enough to drain all hope. He glanced down the aisle again. The flight attendants were trying, but their hands were shaking, their movements frantic and uncertain. Something was clearly happening in the cockpit, something bad. The pilot's announcement had been short and clipped, his voice strained like someone fighting both the aircraft and his own fear. Aiden could tell that even the trained professionals didn't have answers. Passengers' faces turned pale as the plane lurched again, heavier this time, sending a wave of bodies pressed against seatbelts. The engines roared, then sputtered, then roared again. It felt like the aircraft was fighting for its life, battling forces far stronger than it could handle. The overhead panels rattled, lights blinking like failing stars. A bag hit Aiden's shoulder, jolting him back into focused fear. The plane was losing altitude rapidly. The sensation of falling was unmistakable, stomach, dropping, heart, crushing. People kept asking the same desperate question, "What's happening? What's happening?" But there were no answers, only fear. Aiden closed his eyes for a moment, breathing slowly through the mask, trying to think. He knew a little about aviation, enough to understand that a critical systems failure meant multiple things had gone wrong at once. Not just turbulence, not just weather. Something inside the plane was breaking down, and the pilots were losing control. The gravity of that truth hit him like another shake of the aircraft. He looked around, mothers clinging to their kids, couples holding hands, strangers comforting strangers, all united by panic. The moments stretched on like hours. The drop refused to stop. The storm outside intensified, as if the sky was closing its fists around the aircraft. The cabin crew exchanged frantic glances, trying to hide their terror but failing. Fear lived on every face. And Aiden's instincts screamed a message no one wanted to believe. This wasn't just a rough flight. This was a life-or-death fight. The loudspeaker crackled again, but only static came through. No captain, no reassurance, just silence that felt worse than words. Aiden tightened his grip on the armrest, his pulse thundering in his ears. 100 questions flooded his mind. What caused the failure? How close were they to the ground? Could the pilots still save them? But none had answers. Every second felt like the last. And in that terrifying stretch of uncertainty, one thing became absolutely, chillingly clear. Something far worse than turbulence was happening, and no one knew if they were going to make it out alive. The pilot's voice cracked through the speakers. "Is there anyone with aviation experience?" And for a moment, it felt like the entire world inside the cabin stopped breathing. The sentence echoed between rows of panicking passengers, hanging in the air like a final plea for help. Nobody moved, eyes widened, hearts froze. The aircraft continued its terrifying descent, rattling violently as alarms wailed from hidden panels. Aiden sat in the middle of this chaos, feeling the words dig deep into his mind. Aviation experience. He wasn't a pilot, not officially, but he wasn't a normal passenger either. He had spent years immersed in flight simulators, fascinated by aircraft mechanics, devouring manuals of commercial planes while others played video games or scrolled their phones. It was a passion that often made people laugh, but now, that passion might be the only thing standing between life and death for hundreds of souls. Aiden's heart pounded so hard he could feel each beat shaking through his chest. His hands trembled as a war broke out inside him, fear versus responsibility. One side screamed at him to stay seated, to remain just another terrified passenger like the rest. The other side reminded him that doing nothing meant watching the plane spiral toward disaster. He looked around the cabin, faces stained with tears, parents holding their children close, strangers praying out loud, the elderly gripping their hearts in panic. And he understood in an instant, if someone didn't step forward, they were all doomed. His breath hitched as he slowly raised his hand, almost unsure whether he was truly doing it. The nearest flight attendant's eyes widened with a glimmer of hope, as if she'd been holding onto a final thread of faith. "Come with me," she shouted over the roar of the engines. Aiden unbuckled, legs nearly buckling from both fear and the shaking aircraft, as he stumbled down the aisle. Every step toward the front felt like walking into a storm. Passengers stared at him as he passed, some with desperate hope, others with doubt, wondering how someone so young could possibly help. But there was no time for their judgment or his fear. The flight attendant pulled him through a narrow door toward the cockpit, and as it swung open, a wave of cold shock flooded his veins. The captain was slumped dangerously in his seat, blood trailing down the side of his head, his breath shallow and uneven. The co Pilot lay unconscious on the floor, motionless, a dark bruise swelling near his temple. Warning lights flashed everywhere, casting the cockpit in angry reds and flashing ambers. The plane was out of control. Screens flickered with errors Aiden had never seen in simulations. Critical alerts pulsed across every instrument, hydraulics failing, altitude dropping, engine imbalance. The flight attendant squeezed his shoulder. "You said you know aviation. The captain, he can't fly. You have to take over." Her voice broke with fear, but Aiden had no time to question her disbelief or his own capability. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He slid into the co-pilot's seat, hands gripping the control yoke that suddenly felt heavier than anything he'd ever touched. The moment he did, he truly felt the violent pull of gravity dragging the aircraft downward. The nose was pointed too steep. They were falling. Aiden swallowed hard, trying to remember everything he'd studied, every emergency scenario he'd rehearsed in simulations. But this was no simulator. There was no restart button, no second chance. The captain barely opened his eyes, forcing out a weak, fragmented whisper. "Stabilize the aircraft. Don't let her fall." Aiden nodded, voice too shaky to answer. He wrapped both hands around the controls and pulled gently, just like he'd learned, trying to level the plane. The aircraft resisted, shuddering, alarms screaming warnings he couldn't silence. He adjusted the throttle, his fingers remembering the movements from countless simulator hours. The plane lifted slightly, just enough to slow the descent, but then a sudden gust slammed them sideways, lightning flashing outside the cockpit windows like angry daggers of the storm. He gritted his teeth and fought against it. His whole body shook with effort. One wrong move here meant disaster. "Okay, Aiden, focus," he muttered to himself, trying to drown out the chaos with determination. Air traffic control crackled through the speakers, voices shouting instructions, asking for the crew, demanding updates. Aiden reached for the headset, forcing calm into a voice that felt anything but calm. This is Passenger Aiden Carter," he said, his throat tight. "Captain injured, co-pilot unconscious. I've taken control." There was a stunned silence on the other end, followed by a professional but urgent reply. "Copy that, Aiden. We're here with you. Listen closely. We'll guide you step by step." The words gave him something. He desperately needed a lifeline. He began following instructions, adjusting trim, pulling back the nose, fighting the violent shaking that threatened to rip the plane apart. Sweat stung his eyes as he blinked at the flashing screens, trying to decode all the warnings. The flight attendant hovered behind him, clutching the doorframe for balance as the cabin rocked. "Can you do this?" she whispered, voice trembling. Aiden didn't look back. "I have to," he said, because the truth was simple. If he failed, everyone died. Outside, the storm roared louder, rain whipping against the cockpit windows so hard it sounded like bullets. The sky had turned into a twisting labyrinth of clouds and lightning, each flash revealing how dangerously close they were to total loss of control. Aiden's arms ached as he held the yoke steady, fighting turbulence that seemed determined to throw them from the sky. The captain stirred again, groaning weakly, trying to speak. Aiden leaned slightly toward him, still managing the controls. "Just hold on," he said, not sure whether he was reassuring the pilot or himself. The ground radar warning blared, a sound that struck terror into his bones. The plane was too low, way too low. Aiden forced himself to focus on every instruction crackling through the radio, ignoring the panic rising in his chest. He began to regain a tiny bit of control, enough that the steep dive slowed into a rough but survivable descent. The flight attendant rushed to help the captain, securing him and checking his head injury. Aiden kept flying, if his frantic actions could even be called flying. Every second was a battle. Every adjustment felt like a choice between life and death. The enormity of the situation finally hit him. A 22-year-old with no real-world cockpit experience was now the only pilot hundreds of people had left. And as he stared into the storm ahead, the responsibility settled onto his shoulders like the weight of the sky itself. He could hear the terrified cries from the cabin behind the cockpit door. He could feel the plane shuddering with fear along with its passengers. He could sense that the crew was counting on him. The entire world inside that aircraft was depending on a boy who never imagined he'd face a real emergency outside of a simulator. And yet he couldn't back down, not now, not ever. He tightened his grip, breath steadying, eyes locked forward. Whatever came next, storm, failure, fear, death, he would confront it head on, because this wasn't about flying anymore. This was about survival, and Aiden was determined to make sure every person on that plane lived to see the ground again. Hands shaking, Aiden grabbed the controls with every ounce of strength he had left, feeling the cold metal beneath his palms as the yoke trembled violently in his grip. Warning alarms shrieked from every direction, red lights flashing, sharp beeps stabbing into his ears, messages screaming pull up, stall warning, hydraulic failure on the screens in front of him. The plane was still dropping. Its nose pointed downward like gravity was dragging them into the earth with a merciless grip. Aiden could feel the sudden, terrifying lurch of descent in his stomach, as if the ground itself was reaching up to swallow them whole. Every instinct in his body told him to panic, yet he did the opposite. He pulled the headset tighter against his ear, forcing a steady tone into his voice as he spoke to air traffic control. Their voices were rapid but calm, trying to guide him step by step through a crisis most trained pilots never lived through. Adjust pitch 5 degrees, ease the throttle, stabilize your descent rate. Aiden followed each instruction carefully, his fingers flying across unfamiliar buttons, his arms tensed as he fought the raging storm. Rain hammered violently against the cockpit windows, turning the outside world into a blurry nightmare. Lightning cracked across the sky like explosive white veins, illuminating their desperate struggle for split seconds before another wave of darkness swallowed them again. Wind slammed into the aircraft from the side, almost tipping them, and Aiden pushed back with everything he had, sweat dripping down into his eyes, mixing with the burning sting of fear. His breaths came fast, fogging up the oxygen mask, but he didn't dare slow down, not when the lives of every screaming passenger behind him depended solely on him now. The cabin shook like a leaf in a hurricane, passengers clutching their seats and each other, some whispering prayers through trembling lips while others cried openly, accepting the horrifying possibility that they might never see their homes or loved ones again. Children wailed, their cries piercing through the muffled roar of the storm. The flight attendants, though terrified themselves, moved down the aisle trying to calm others, telling them to stay belted, to breathe through their masks, to stay strong, though everyone could see the fear in their eyes as they glanced toward the cockpit door. Aiden could almost feel their hopes pressing against his back, like every soul on the plane was leaning on him to survive. His heart pounded so violently that it almost drowned out the alarms, but he forced himself to focus. He had spent years mastering flight simulation systems. Now that knowledge was no longer a hobby, no longer a passion. It was suddenly the only lifeline they had. The ground radar warning blared again, a stomach-dropping sound that announced only one thing: they were too low. Aiden's pulse surged with panic as he eased back on the controls a little more, his arms shaking from the strain. The aircraft finally began to respond, the terrifying plunge slowing into a rough, uneven flight path. He drew in a sharp breath, a tiny spark of hope flickering to life inside him. Come on, he muttered under his breath, clenching his jaw as thunder boomed outside like cannon fire. Air traffic control continued feeding instructions into his headset, voices layered with urgency but also a lifeline of belief. You're doing good. Aiden, keep her steady focus on the horizon. But there was barely any horizon to see. Darkness and storm swallowed everything. It felt like navigating through a void with nothing but instinct, mathematics, and the will to survive. A strong blast of wind shoved the plane again, sending it tilting violently to the right. Aiden gasped and steered immediately, muscles screaming as he fought to level the wings. The entire aircraft responded like a massive, wounded beast refusing to obey. Metal groaned, vibrations rattled the cockpit walls. The storm howled like a living monster hungry for destruction. Aiden's eyes darted across the controls, mentally reviewing everything he had ever learned about aircraft failure procedures. He remembered simulator scenario system overrides, manual control techniques, how to distribute thrust to regain balance. But this wasn't a scenario, this was reality, and mistakes meant death. He worked with precision fueled by terror, adjusting flaps and stabilizers, every movement measured and deliberate. For a moment, the plane responded, leveling out into something that felt like stability. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He forced himself to breathe slow, controlled breaths, to keep his hands from shaking. "Not today," he whispered, so soft at first that it was only a thought escaping his lips. Then he said it again, louder, fiercer. "Not today." It became his anchor, his shield against fear. He repeated it every time the storm tried to steal back control. Not today, no one was dying today. With each small victory, every slight correction that reduced their fall, every second they stayed in the air rather than crashing, confidence began to build inside him. Fear didn't disappear, but determination grew stronger, fighting alongside it. The injured captain stirred weakly in the seat beside him, barely conscious. Aiden glanced at him just long enough to see the faint worry in the man's fading eyes. A pilot who had flown his entire life, now helpless in the hands of a 22-year-old passenger. Aiden gave him the smallest nod, promising silently that he would not let the sky win. The radio crackled with ATC updates, coordinates, distance to the nearest runway, weather conditions. They were guiding him toward hope, but the storm was still trying to tear that hope away. Every second felt like running through a burning building, no guarantee of escape. Only the drive to keep moving forward. Passengers behind the cockpit door could feel the change. Some lifted their heads, daring to hope when the shaking eased ever so slightly. Others peeked out windows as clouds shifted, searching desperately for some sign that they were rising instead of falling. The cabin had been filled with screams, but now prayers whispered a little louder than panic because someone was fighting for them. Someone they would have never expected, someone who chose courage over fear. Then the plane jolted again, the storm roaring back with renewed rage. Aiden tightened his grip, holding them steady through the turbulence. Air traffic control spoke urgently. "Aiden, runway is ahead. You're doing this. Stay with us." Those words hit him like a burst of energy. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were heading toward salvation. But the battle was far from won. The storm was still clawing at them. Systems were still failing. The descent was still dangerous. And Aiden was still just a young man in a seat he was never supposed to occupy. Yet he refused to let go. Not today, not this plane, not these people. He stared straight ahead into the violent storm, jaw tight, heart fierce, and continued to fight the sky itself, determined to bring every soul on that aircraft back home alive. Two faint white specks glowing through the thick curtain of clouds. Aiden blinked hard, afraid his mind was imagining them, but then they grew clearer, brighter runway lights. The only hope they had left. His heart flipped as adrenaline surged through him once more, but there was no time to celebrate. He had to land the plane. The storm was still raging, winds punching against the aircraft like a furious giant, trying to push them off course. He tightened his grip on the controls, forcing his breath steady as air traffic control continued guiding him. Align with the centerline, reduce speed, easy on the nose. His hands moved quickly but carefully, every motion a desperate balance between control and chaos. The cabin behind him had fallen into strained silence, broken only by muffled sobs, whispered prayers, and the rattling of loose luggage. People held each other tightly, lovers, strangers, parents clutching children, all united by the same fragile hope. The ground loomed closer, the runway stretching like salvation beneath them, lights twinkling through streaks of rain on the windows. Aiden lined up the nose perfectly, eyes sharp, every nerve in his body alert and burning. The aircraft shook violently as crosswinds tried to steal control again, pushing them sideways. "Come on, hold it," he whispered through clenched teeth. A lightning flash illuminated the runway straight ahead. They were seconds from touchdown. The final moment arrived. Aiden pulled the nose slightly up, letting the wheels prepare to take the force. The entire cabin braced, eyes squeezed shut, fingers digging into armrests, muscles stiff with fear. Then, boom, the wheels slammed onto the runway with a deafening crash. Metal groaned like a wounded animal as sparks scattered beneath the plane. Oxygen masks and loose objects swung wildly as passengers jolted forward in their seats. Screeching rubber echoed through the fuselage while the aircraft bounced hard against the ground, fighting for traction. Aiden mashed the brakes and reversed the engines just like he'd practiced in simulators. But this time the stakes were real. The consequences life or death. The plane skidded, tires screaming against the soaked runway, sliding dangerously close to the edge. Rainwater splashed up across the windows, turning everything into shimmering streaks of silver and black. The runway raced by, too fast, too unstable, but Aiden held on, refusing to let go, refusing to lose now, not after coming this far. "Stop, stop, stop," he yelled, as if sheer determination could slow the world, and then suddenly it did. The violent motion eased, the horrible screeching softened, and the aircraft finally slowed to a full stop. For a moment, no one moved, no one even breathed. The silence that followed was heavy, unreal, like the pause between heartbeats when the world forgets how to continue. Aiden didn't even realize tears were falling until he felt them drop onto his trembling hands. His muscles slowly relaxed, exhaustion flooding his body like a wave. He looked around the cockpit, blinking, stunned alive. Behind the door, that silence shattered into the loudest, most beautiful sound imaginable, a roar of pure relief. Passengers broke into applause, screams of joy, and sobs bursting from chests that had held fear for too long. People hugged whoever was closest, strangers embracing like family, because survival had turned them all into one. Flight attendants were crying and laughing at the same time, their terror finally melting into gratitude. The injured captain opened his eyes, breath shaky but alive, staring at the young man who had just saved his plane, his passengers. With visible effort, he lifted a hand, placing it weakly on Aiden's shoulder, a silent thank you that carried every word he didn't have the strength to say. Aiden pulled off the headset, barely able to believe what he'd done. His chest felt tight, his heartbeat wild, adrenaline still surging through every vein, but beneath all of that was something he'd never felt before, pride. He had done the impossible. He leaned back against the seat, letting reality slowly catch up. The passengers soon saw the cockpit door swing open and Aiden step out, not in a pilot's uniform, not with the authority of a trained aviator, just a 22-year-old kid in jeans and a sweatshirt, and yet the savior of every life on that aircraft. People reached for him, tears streaming, voices quivering. "Thank you, God bless you, you saved us." Some bowed their heads in gratitude, others simply stared at him in awe, hardly believing that this ordinary young man had done something so extraordinary. Camera flashes began, someone started cheering louder, and within seconds, the entire plane erupted into applause that shook the cabin walls harder than the storm ever had. Aiden's face turned red with embarrassment, but his smile, shaky, stunned, and full of relief, said everything. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He wasn't just a kid with an aviation hobby. He was a hero, one who refused to surrender when death stared them all in the face. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles rushed toward the aircraft outside, but inside there was only celebration, pure, unforgettable celebration. People would go home tonight, hug their families, and tell them the story of the young stranger who fought a storm and saved their lives. They would remember his courage forever, and Aiden, he would remember the moment a voice asked for help, and he chose to raise his hand. A moment where fear could have won, but he did instead, one moment that changed everything. Because on that day, in the heart of the sky's fury, a 22-year-old passenger became the reason hundreds of hearts still beat. A hero born not from training, not from duty, but from a single decision to stand up when no one else could. And that decision would forever be remembered as the moment hope took control, and the impossible was overcome.